All right, well, good evening and welcome to Unforgivable, a discussion about clerical sexual abuse from New Ulm, Minnesota to Guatemala. We are thrilled that you have braved the weather and finding this room snuck away in a corner to join us, and those of you who have joined us online. So my name is Nathanael Homewood. I'm the Associate Director of Religious Studies here at the U. And to get started, I just want to run through some really practical details. So first, for those of you who are in the room, there's still food out there, lots of it. Feel free to go get food at any point. There are also bathrooms out there and kind of to the left. All right, I can't give bathroom advice to those who are online. Please mute yourself if you do need to go. Secondly, if you are not currently connected to the program, I'm looking around, most of you are, but I would encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. There's a form that our fearless student workers, Akia, made out there for you to sign up for. Finally, just to give you some idea of the format of what's going to happen tonight, first, Kevin is going to read a little bit from the preface of his book, Unforgivable, which will give us all a common starting point. If you didn't yet receive a copy of the book, make sure you see me afterwards. And I must provide the obvious warning, right? Clerical sexual abuse is a triggering topic. We recognize the incredible and widespread hurt that has occurred. Kevin and Pat are professionals. They've thought deeply about how to carefully and thoughtfully and sensitively approach these topics. But we also ask that you engage in self-care. So participate to the degree that you are comfortable with, and we understand if you need to at any point disengage. So after Kevin shares the preface, I will engage Pat and Kevin in a conversation, and then we will open it up for a question and answer period. If you are online, feel free to enter your question into the chat at any point, and Zakia will do her best to make sure that those questions are heard. So some big picture stuff about the Religious Studies program for those who aren't familiar. It's led, right? It started in 2008. It's led by the incredibly talented and my boss, Dr. Catherine Gerbner. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Catherine's impressive book and groundbreaking book, Archival Eruptions, was actually released today by Duke University Press. So congratulations, Catherine. The Religious Studies program is an interdepartmental program. We have 48 core and affiliate faculty representing 17 departments, and we're growing. Last year, we added a fantastic scholar in early Islam, and this year we are hiring a scholar of Buddhism. We offer a major, a minor, and a minor in Islamic studies. And for those of you in my class, you know the expectation is you will sign up for at least one of those options. And speaking of which, to the students who are here, thank you so much. We really appreciate the work you do, and especially to the Religious Worlds of the Twin Cities course. I think so highly of all of you, and I think you are doing incredible work engaging the diversity of religions that are coursing through our cities. So thank you for making time to come outside of class hours. Our program works hard to bring together students, scholars, and community members to study religion in a robust way that meets the demands of the current world, and there is always room for more contributors. Whether you want to sign up for a major, become an affiliated faculty member, provide financial support, or be involved in some other way, please introduce yourself to me this afternoon. I would love to connect with you. I also want to note that we are very grateful of the support and generosity of our co-sponsors. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Anthropology, the Department of History, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, and the Institute for Advanced Study. So finally, let me introduce our discussants for today. Patrick J. Wall is a Lake City, Minnesota native, former monk and priest of St. John's Abbey. I've only recently learned from Patrick about St. John's, not the but St. John's dominance over McAllister recently in football. He was assigned to the Twin Cities parishes in the 1990s, replacing priests accused of child sex assault. Mr. Wall earned a bachelor's in philosophy, a master's of divinity, and an LLM in canon law. As an advocate for survivors, Patrick has testified in criminal, civil, and bankruptcy proceedings and is co-author of the book Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes, the Catholic Church's 2,000-year paper trail of sexual abuse. Mr. Wall worked on the cases we are discussing and will reflect on that in the local context. So thank you so much for coming, Pat. It's really a privilege. Kevin Lewis O'Neill is Dean of Arts and Vice Provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He's also a professor in, just a spoiler alert, this bio goes for a while. It's one of those bios that when you're reading it out loud or not out loud, you realize you haven't done much with your life, okay? So he's also a professor in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center of Diaspora and Transnational Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. A cultural anthropologist, Kevin has written extensively on the politics of Christianity in Guatemala City. His books include City of God, Secure the Soul, Hunted, and the bilingual photography book Art of Captivity. 2021 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow. Kevin's most recent book is the one that brings us here today, Unforgivable, An Abusive Priest and the Church That Sent Him Abroad. His next book will be a global history of clerical sexual abuse that begins near the Badlands of New Mexico. And if you've read the book, or now will have the opportunity to read the book, there is hints of that project found in Unforgivable. He also teaches a popular first-year course that is 1,000 students called Happiness. He otherwise divides his time between writing journal articles, directing the Evasion Lab, and editing a book series with the University of California Press called Atelier. Thank you so much for your work, Kevin, and for coming here to share it with us. I ask that you join me in welcoming Kevin and Pat to the U. This is why I need you, Zakia. There we go. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone here and online. Nathanael, Catherine, the co-sponsors. I'll just read briefly from the book, as Nathanael says, to give kind of a shared text. And then what I really love to do is have a conversation. The opportunity for me to have a conversation with Pat is always fantastic. Also to answer your questions and those online is really great for me. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here in Minnesota, which is where the book begins. Minneapolis, Minnesota, March 17th, 1994. Waves of businessmen ambled toward their respective gates of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport as Father David Roney waited patiently for his flight to Guatemala. He had a single suitcase at his side. It held his passport, a point-and-shoot camera, and 5 of everything that he was wearing: a pressed white shirt, dark pleated pants, and a pair of black socks. There were also cotton t-shirts and underwear that his mother had bleached months before her passing, as well as an extra pair of prescription glasses. He had a toothbrush, but no toothpaste. He figured that he could buy a tube once he landed. He was traveling light. A full month before his trip, once Roney had really made the decision to live out his days at a Catholic mission in the distant highlands of Guatemala, he began to shed as many of his belongings as he could. His goal, however unreasonable it may have seemed at the time, was to fit his entire life into a single suitcase. No one needs 3 pairs of shoes, he reasoned, when 1 pair is enough. But then there were the books that he had lugged over the years from parish to parish, his many slides of Rome, and several boxes of memories that his mother had left for him. He placed these items with friends in Minnesota, promising to send for them at some point, but he never did. He even left behind a plaque that he had received just a day earlier during a celebration of his 50 years of service as a diocesan priest in central Minnesota. There had been a nice meal and some nicer words, with glasses of wine raised to his priesthood. Though he commented that it was all very generous, he excused himself from the festivities a little earlier than expected, insisting that he needed to finish packing. But his suitcase was full. Nothing else would have fit. Roni's retirement to Guatemala might have provoked a twinge of nostalgia or melancholy. He was on the precipice of a momentous life transition, a self-conscious shedding of possessions and friendships. Yet he also had good reason to be excited for his future. His suitcase might not have fit his books and slides, but it also did not have room for a thick stack of psychological evaluations that he had accrued over the years. A medical archive that often fussed over how his, quote, exhibitionism is clinically distinct from pedophilia. None of that documentation would have traveled with him to Guatemala, and neither would his diagnosis. Roni would instead evade the archive and its effects by relocating to the mission, which lacked not only telephone service and consistent electricity, but also a diocesan review board for sexual misconduct. None of this board's confidential reports, clinical notes, and medical tests of sexual function would ever make it to Guatemala. Roni's move to the mission would effectively set him free, and he knew it. So too did his bishop. As his plane lifted from the tarmac, the acceleration pressing his body back into his seat, Roni's future was suddenly as clear and open as the sky itself. Unforgivable tells the story of Father David Roni, a Roman Catholic priest and sexual predator, in 5 parts. From his prolifically abusive career in central Minnesota, part 1, to his evaluation at a church-run sex therapy center in New Mexico, part 2, to his semi-active retirement in the highlands of Guatemala, where he raised an indigenous orphan as his own, part 3. It also tells the story of the multi-million-dollar settlement that Roni's stateside survivors received from the church, part 4, and the many attempts that the orphan, now a young woman in Guatemala, made to receive a settlement of her own, part 5. But this isn't a book just about Roni. It's a look at the Roman Catholic Church's long-standing practice of moving sexually abusive priests across international borders. The story of clerical sexual abuse has thus far been rather local. The first U.S. scandals surfaced in Louisiana and then Minnesota in the 1980s. There were others in New Orleans, Milwaukee, and Chicago in the early 1990s, and then a spate of cases in Boston in 2001. Many more followed from Los Angeles, California, to Covington, Kentucky, to Anchorage, Alaska, with dioceses and religious orders paying billions of dollars in settlements to victims. The coverage of these events has focused almost exclusively on how bishops across the United States transferred known perpetrators from parish to parish, often in a failed effort at shirking accountability for their clerics' crimes. While this interest in inter-parish transfer has been important in demonstrating to both juries and the general public some of the church's more pernicious maneuvers, it has sidelined a much bigger story. Church leaders routinely move sexual predators clear across the world to live, preach, and perpetrate crimes, often with total impunity. Unforgivable details the transfer of one such priest from Minnesota to Guatemala, but it could have told the story of nearly hundreds of other sexually abusive priests. There was nothing extraordinary about David Roni, but by following his itinerary in granular detail, this book takes a first and important step, not just in documenting the global movement of sexually abusive clerics, but also in rendering the conditions of clerical sexual abuse itself thinkable. It accomplishes the second task by showing how clerical sexual abuse can only exist in rather specific contexts, where there is, for example, the rule of law, a free press, psychological expertise, and a robust insurance industry. These are contexts where a diagnosis of sexual deviancy has practical consequences and where the identities of abuser, victim, and survivor mean something. The United States in the late 20th and early 21st centuries was one such place. But the country of Guatemala, certainly at the time of Roni's first visit in 1973 and even at the time of his retirement in 1994, was not. It had neither the courts nor the journalists, therapists, or insurance companies necessary to sustain a framework for identifying and prosecuting clerical sexual abuse. Thus, in a very practical sense, clerical sexual abuse did not exist in Guatemala when Roney landed at the country's international airport on March 17, 1994. The historical contingency of such abuse is this book's most important and least intuitive insight. But bishops have understood this point for decades, and that's why they sent Roney to Central America. Roney's bishop also knew that no one would likely notice his arrival. Guatemala had been at war with itself for decades. In 1954, the United States Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated a coup d'etat against Guatemala's democratically elected government. The CIA's intention was to stop the spread of communism in Central America, but the results of the coup were disastrous. An increasingly militarized government deployed scorched earth tactics, riddled the nation with large-scale massacres, in the end murdering 200,000 civilians, disappearing 50,000 more, and displacing 1 million. Conveniently for Roney, the vast majority of those impacted by this genocidal violence lived in small indigenous towns where the rule of law had all but been suspended. Amid the fog of war, how could anyone question an American priest who cared so deeply for this country's orphans? In Guatemala, Roney lived not simply beyond the reach of therapists, law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and journalists, but more profoundly beyond the conditions that make clerical sexual abuse possible. The focus on the historical contingency of clerical sexual abuse, however, does not mean that the prurient touch of a priest can only affect a person once there are enough lawyers, psychologists, and journalists on the scene. The experience of the orphan whom Roney raised in Guatemala is evidence enough to the contrary. I slept in his home, she told me. He bathed me. He had me bring my friends over to his house to play. Roney embedded himself in this young girl's life, shaping her trajectory in ways that were profound and indisputable. As this book shows, though, the process of taking such personal experiences and turning them into a set of public facts remains easier to do in the United States than in Guatemala. This is because the conceptual and administrative tools necessary to recognize clerical sexual abuse are not equally available everywhere in the world. Since at least the late 20th century, U.S. bishops have leveraged a series of cultural disconnects between the United States and certain parts of Latin America to safeguard themselves and the Catholic Church from scandal and financial settlements. In the United States, but not in Guatemala, activists molded clerical sexual abuse into a focus for political action. In the United States, but not in Guatemala, psychologists empowered people to recognize themselves as victims of clerical sexual abuse and as survivors. And in the United States, but not in Guatemala, personal injury attorneys made clerical sexual abuse a vehicle for institutional accountability and constitutional reform. Experts made clerical sexual abuse recognizable in the United States, while an absence of expertise made the phenomenon unspeakable in Guatemala. This is why Roney so eagerly absconded to Central America with the support of his bishop. On the other side of a continent, this priest could do as he wished, while Guatemalans could do very little. Thank you. That was just kind of a 10-minute part and a decent transition to a conversation.
We're just going to, Zakia, I'm going to start panning. We need to manually move the video camera so that it, do you want to tell me when to stop?
The camera's off on there, and everybody's just watching this camera. So.
Oh,
Yeah.
so I don't need to move it anymore.
That's what. Yeah,
I had practiced with the buttons and everything. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Your writing is haunting. It's beautiful, and it is extraordinarily thought-provoking. So we'll return to the preface in a moment, and it does give those of you who haven't read the book some sense of how this book came about. But Patrick, I want to turn to you first. Can you share with us some of your story, how you came to learn of clerical sexual abuse, some of the work you have done, and then finally, how did you become aware of Kevin and this project and projects?
Sure. I went to St. John's as an undergrad. I was raised Roman Catholic. And then I got the religion bug, so I joined the monastery. And then in my training, when I came back from school, I was home about 30 days. And after morning prayer, the abbot came and knocked on my door. Strange, because the abbot never goes up to third floor Breuer. And he says, I need you to be the faculty resident on second floor Mary today. And that's because the monk that was there had been removed because of childhood sexual assault allegations. And, I was just the paratrooper going in. And that's essentially what happened to me for the next 6 years. And that's how I ended up in the Archdiocese. I was never trained to be a parish priest. I was going to be an academic priest, coach college football and be a monk at St. John's. There was never a consideration that I would end up in a parish, because that's where there's a lot of academic stuff. You actually have to do business things, right? In running the religion and running the parish. And then also while I'm there, because I'm canonist, I get stuck on the tribunal. But then if you have a priest case that's in front of you, a priest who sexually assaults a minor, the church has its own legal system, has its own independent jurisdiction, and a legal system that's one of the oldest functioning legal systems in the Western world, as many of you know. And so I passed the exam. I know what Canon 1395.2 is, but it's like a lot of things. It doesn't lodge anywhere. Then all of a sudden you have a priest case in front of you and you look at the code, and then that code doesn't apply because it's a pre-1983 case. So then you have to go to the 1917 code. So you pop open the 1917 code, and then if you're intellectually curious at all, you're going to check the footnotes to see where that law came from. And sure enough, it's based on a document from the 17th century. And you go, whoa, this is not new. And then if you chase that further, and all the documents are on the shelf, you go to any Catholic university, all of these documents are on the shelf, they're not in English. And so you are discovering the in-depth of this. And then when you start to look at these different priest files, you find that many of them have gone away to secret closed loop treatment facilities, and there are medical diagnoses sitting pre-HIPAA and sitting in the priest personnel file that you can request from the chancellor to bring up from the archives. And you're using all of this evidence to prove why he should be dismissed from the clerical state. Difference is, our standard is that you have to prove at the time of ordination he should never have been ordained. So you literally have to throw the entire kitchen sink of evidence into the case. And after doing several hundred different cases, mid-30s, I was done. I just couldn't take that any longer. And so I left, and I thought I would be fine. And one of the first phone calls I got, now had moved to Southern California, all of a sudden, some judge by the name of Miles Lord, right, gives me a call, and his son is also practicing law, and they have a priest case against St. John's, and they're trying to figure out the veracity of this and whether anybody at the Abbey actually knew. I said, yes, Your Honor. I mean, even I, who knew who Miles Lord was at that point, I thought I was in trouble, honestly. And so it just kind of grew from there. I started testifying in different things, and then I found it was more effective to be embedded in law firms where I could be a force multiplier, working with a lot of lawyers in doing this, so they don't get lost in the veneer of the canonical world. And so it just kept on going from there. One of a whole bunch of intakes I've done over the years, David Roney had a very specific fact pattern, right? And you can't think of a better guy who's crazy enough to to actually go to Guatemala and interview survivors. Yeah, yeah. But who has the language skills, he has what I would call almost a blank tabula rasa, not agnostic, but an openness just to see what's there. Just work with the facts. Doesn't have a theological bent or a bunch of cards in the game. And so Kevin really was the perfect guy for the David Roney case. And there are so many women that were young girls that were sexually assaulted, both here in southern Minnesota and in Guatemala. It's just an amazing case.
So, Kevin, your book that you just shared with us opens with this, right, kind of quiet but devastating image of Father Roney at the airport traveling, quote unquote, light. What drew you to begin the book there, and how does that scene encapsulate or point towards things in the larger story that you're telling us about clerical abuse and institutional evasion?
Thank you so much. Yeah, the book does begin for me in the middle, in a sense of, if we look at the full arc of David Roney's trajectory as really a patterned perpetrator. The end of the book has a list of similar characters who've moved from North America, or perpetrators from North America to Latin America. But the idea of Roney, beginning the book with Roney in flight, for me marked kind of a fundamental experience of the research. I started the research, now while Pat came across the case in Minnesota, and there's been such tremendously important journalistic work here in Minnesota about clerical sexual abuse, really established. I heard about David Roney in Guatemala and the young woman, the orphan and now young woman who he raised. What I found immediately so compelling about the project, which I think reflects the tactic that the church uses, is, wow, I mean, there's just a lot. I mean, as an anthropologist who's worked in Guatemala for a quarter century, I'm stunned at the amount of archival evidence in North America that there is on just this one guy. And I'm continually shocked, like Pat and I are on a project at the University of New Mexico with similar cases. I'm just stunned at the amount of archival material on each individual case. In Guatemala, it just goes cold. When he leaves in 1994 for Guatemala, that paper trail, and this is the tactic and this is the strategy, the paper trail just goes silent. We don't know anything about Roney afterwards. And so as an anthropologist, who through the method of ethnography kind of has always constructed my own archive of evidence through interviews and engaging communities for very, very long periods of time, I was able to piece together a sense of what life was like for Roney and certainly the survivors afterwards. But that kind of beginning in the middle, for me, is that important fulcrum in terms of extraordinary amounts of documentation in North America, hardly anything in Guatemala. And so that flight becomes, for me, the kind of representation of that central tactic of movement.
So, Kevin, you write about the church's movement of abusive priests across borders, and that it's not extraordinary, that it's actually routine. And you mentioned the list just to Latin America that's in the back of your book. So Patrick, as someone who has worked within these systems and then later helped to expose them, what mechanisms, legal, canonical, cultural, allowed such transfers to happen so seamlessly? And if you could, in particular, share how this concept of jurisdiction is implicated in a story that is global in ways that transcends boundaries, and yet jurisdiction keeps showing up. And then Kevin, perhaps if you could add on to that, jurisdiction as an anthropological concept.
So first of all, remember the Holy See is its own separate and independent country. So this is where religion and state really does kind of come together in a bizarre way. So this is a large international church, but how in the world did this simple bishop from New Ulm, Minnesota, if anybody's been to New Ulm, you know what I'm talking about. How in the world did he know how to do all of this stuff? And so if you look through the Roney file, you see a very educated, experienced person, and you go, where did Raymond Lucker come from? Oh yeah, he was a priest here in the archdiocese. He was in the chancery, so he had all of that administrative experience. He had all of that in-house training on what to do when you have a priest that is sexually assaulting a minor. And one of the things that this case does so extremely well is it shows that Bishop Lucker showed extreme prudence in keeping the scandal under control by using local therapists first, using the principle of Roman subsidiarism and just ratcheting up the control and putting all of this together and then documenting it for the secret archives. Canon 489 mandates that he maintain all of these documents. In the process of working through, David Roney starts out as a priest here in the archdiocese. The only big parish he ever served in was the Basilica. After that, he was in tiny parishes for the rest of his life. Translation, theoretically, a minimum exposure to his target population. So they're already demonstrating administratively they knew what to do. As you go through, you start to see that in this movement, he goes out to St. Croix Beach, just south of Stillwater, right? Tiny little parish there. And then they keep moving. And he works with various local therapists. He works then, eventually, what the bishop has to do is he has to get him to the servants of the Paraclete, which is one of our closed loop treatment center systems. And in that, he is treated for his various proclivities. He opens up and it's documented what his target population is. The exhibitionism thing, Kevin's not making it up, it's clearly in the file. And then as you go through, you start to see that as he's bumping from parish to parish, he's out at Benson at St. Francis Xavier, he's helping out at St. Malachy's in Clontarf, and then he ends up in Wilmer. But it gets so hot, there really is nowhere to treat him anymore. They don't send him to Wilmer State Hospital with Father Garvey. Father Garvey's already treated several pretty well-known perps there. They then, using the various powers that are available to every Roman Catholic bishop, then they work within the extraterritorial part of jurisdiction that a bishop has. Because most dioceses will have some kind of a foreign mission. So the foreign mission's a perfect spot for him to go to. And then it all just kind of stops, right? And unfortunately, the girls are left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And this question of jurisdiction for those. So the book is working on a few different registers. One is to get the story out as much as possible in an accessible way. The other, as an anthropologist, I have conceptual interests and theoretical concerns. This question of jurisdiction is really important in terms of cultural and social anthropology today, and I can just give like a 2-minute or a 1-minute kind of reason why, and why this is such an extraordinary study of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is just the claiming of authority. So at what point, who has authority over us and at what point? And it's interesting to reflect on moments of jurisdictional pluralism when there is like competing, overlapping, or sometimes like slightly disconnected that creates gaps in this jurisdiction. We have actually in the 21st century in North America a pretty consolidated sense of authority and layers of authority. What the Roman Catholic Church, just to add on what Pat said, has proven itself so incredibly adept and sophisticated at spotting are moments of jurisdictional kind of confusion or jurisdictional weaknesses in the world. I mean, given the footprint of this institution, it's not surprising that it has access to nearly every corner of the world. And when I say in the preface that the kind of like jurisdictional or administrative tools necessary to make a claim of clerical sexual abuse consequential, that those resources aren't evenly distributed around the world, that's the church's forte, is to spot a place like the highlands of Guatemala as not just different culturally, and this is where anthropologists really have begun to love jurisdiction, because we used to make kind of cultural arguments that things are just culturally different in Guatemala. It doesn't hold very well, but the question of jurisdiction is one that does, in the sense that the legal structure, the psychological infrastructure, medical infrastructure, all the different kind of institutions that claim authority are structured differently. And so what Unforgivable does as a study of jurisdiction is spot how a global institution is able to achieve certain kinds of arbitrage, finding pockets where, for example, Roni could live pretty much unencumbered. So Guatemala at the time of his retirement, and this isn't unusual for a country in the midst of a civil war, had a very underdeveloped legal system and did not have any law in the books that would allow anyone to prosecute anyone for the sexual abuse of a child. The kind of most proximate law was the production of pornography, which is like a $50 fine. So Guatemala, especially the highlands, on the other side of a giant lake and a volcano, was the perfect place to kind of stash him, because jurisdictionally there wasn't a consistent and reliable authority to hold him accountable.
Building on that, right, I think that maybe the most striking argument that you make is this argument that clerical sexual abuse is historically contingent, right? That it can only exist in this case where there are courts and journalists and psychologists and doctors and that naming it as such. So I wonder if you could say more on that, because it's like you said in the introduction, right? It's like one of the most pressing, but it's not intuitive. So maybe unpack for us a little bit more what that means, and then how that plays into both the existence of and erasure of abuse globally.
Yeah, it's the least intuitive argument of the book. There's a way that the story could simply be told and all of us would feel appropriately kind of outraged by a priest moving from North America to Central America and evading law enforcement and accountability. But the category of jurisdiction raises the possibility for us to think about contexts in which not only is he beyond the law, Roni, but beyond a context in which the category of, for example, pedophilia, or even just clerical sexual abuse more broadly, isn't a coherent or recognizable term in this particular context. There is certainly within Guatemala, especially the highlands, a community concern for the mistreatment of children. And in that community, there are consequences, and they're laid out in the book, which Roni skirts. But as we see in North America, there's really not a vernacular, nor a legal system ready to respond, nor a public kind of conversation that makes room for clerical sexual abuse until the 1980s, early 1980s. That same kind of conversation and those same kind of resources have not yet arrived in Guatemala and many other parts of the world. Most, in fact. The US is such an anomaly because of its legal system and the kind of extraordinary work that survivors have done in the United States to bring this issue into the public. We forget, or it's easy to forget, that other parts of the world aren't in the place that we are at to have this public event, to have these conversations, for survivors to have a sense of like rights and seeking justice. That's not in Guatemala right now. That itself is an extraordinary kind of breakage or disconnect. And what makes it kind of brutal is that the church manipulates that and will move people to places where, I argue in the book, there is no practical conversation about clerical sexual abuse. There's also like a very conceptual argument to make. I teach a class it's the whole argument of the semester. And I could get into it if we want to get the philosophical angle, but it's really about existing beyond the reach of consequence and accountability when it comes to naming crimes as such.
Yeah. So then, Patrick, transitioning from that, you have deep ties in Minnesota, right? In its parishes, with its survivors, in its archives. How does that local story, right, the central Minnesota story, illuminate broader patterns in the global Catholic Church, right? The fact that, as we just heard, right, Guatemala still doesn't have an infrastructure to name this as such and provide certain rights and justices. And so, what does that mean to understand the Minnesota model? Is that still happening, right? Is the movement like that still happening? And is the Minnesota model of concealment and exposure a helpful one to understand what is happening around the globe?
I think understanding the pattern of how a bishop is able to move someone, because remember now we have zero tolerance, theoretically. And so there's a more of a responsibility to report. There's more of a responsibility to investigate, and instead of just doing the geographic solution and, well, he's not doing really well at St. Croix Beach, so maybe we need to get him to Benson. That kind of thing is not going to fly here, but it flies around the rest of the world because there's a different standard, totally different standard of care. I don't know as if the intellectual categories of understanding childhood sexual assault have permeated other countries. Certain countries, oh my, in Australia and also in Ireland, the number of governmental inquiries has just been amazing to show movement. Even Australia sent people to the servants of the Paraclete, just like David Roney did. And there have been different movements and different standards. We as a church have been studying this since the early 20th century, with Thomas Verner Moore, trying to come up with a tool to indicate or detect insanity rates before someone actually is admitted all the way through seminary to ordination. And then there have been, Dr. Braceland was at the Seton Institute in Baltimore. And so there's been many people trained to try to understand this. The bottom line is it really goes back to the old medieval monastic understanding. The only thing we can do is to isolate guys that perpetrate. There really is no effective way to, prior to ordination, to weed out, to screen, to identify. This is a very serious psychiatric problem, and it's not a sin in and by itself. It's a criminal act with a very serious psychiatric diagnosis. That's why we in the church make the distinction between a pedophile and a phoebophile for a very long time, because there are very distinct actions that happen. So there's a greater knowledge that exists within this institution that doesn't exist in most other religions. There are some patterns, I think, in the use of jurisdiction that are really super helpful to know how a transnational can get and cover this up. Part of it is under the color and scope of their work. So for instance, because New Ulm had the mission, sending him to go work with Father Schaefer in the mission looked normal. In fact, if you wanted to, you could go through the Catholic directory and find it way down in very small print. So technically, he was under assignment, under obedience of his bishop, to be there. So in the course and scope of his work, he's there. Also, one of the things that happens within Catholic history as you go through, different institutions rise up to respond. And there has been an incredible amount of extreme institutional response to create these institutions and to create these various pockets for jurisdiction to be able to cover this up. one of the monks that I had to replace, Fran, he was caught in Cold Spring. And so what they did, just like Roni, they took him down to MSP, and he got a one-way MSP DCA right into St. Luke Institute. And then as the Stearns County Sheriff is after him and coming to the Abbot to be able to interview him for this, the response that comes back from Father Michael Peterson, the director of the St. Luke Institute, is, we've got this under control. We got this, which is almost the exact same language that's in the Roni file. So the phraseology is there. We almost never talk about the conduct. And so the ability to get somebody to a specific facility and then get a medical diagnosis with extreme knowledge that then comes back, that stays in the file and that is living history, is, I think, a powerful piece that still is not known very well. And as these various institutions rise up and fall because of litigation here in the United States, all they do is they morph and they move, because the tradition and the thought pattern continues, in my experience, and that's where the future danger is.
Was arrested, correct? Or like somewhat shortly before, or there was some sort of possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the archive, there's record of him being arrested.
Shortly before his departure, right?
That's what the material.
That's what it says. Okay. So sticking with all of this now, I want to come back to the historical contingency of abuse for a moment. What are, right, the way in which it is set up, and I think it's crucial that you point out that it's not cultural, right? But is you have places that don't have these categories, and you have places with infrastructure that do have these categories. What are the risks in, right, telling a story in which one place is seen as not having, like, the infrastructure to create this category, and in what ways is it possible that, right, there are other ways of handling, think that maybe the category is unnecessary to get to some sense of justice or possibility?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, so just to kind of, so at the core of the book is this argument, just kind of to restate it, that part of the arbitrage the church is participating in or executing is, and I guess one of the main kind of parts of this story, and this was somewhat new to me, but as an anthropologist, I really appreciate it, that a priest, after the sacrament of ordination, or a seminarian who then becomes a priest, the sacrament of ordination, is permanently a priest. This is the Catholic theology of the priesthood. One is ontologically transformed in this process of becoming a priest. You can never unpriest a priest. They are forever a priest. This creates, for me, or at least for the church, but also for myself, that a sexually abusive priest is not an HR issue. It is something much, much larger, understanding the relationship of the priest's mediation between the divine and the human. They have this very storied and elevated position in humankind from the church's perspective. So the ability to unpriest a priest is off the table, but what is on the table is to, for example, change the kinds of categories of diagnosis that they've received. So if Roni over several decades in Minnesota continues to accrue and did continue to accrue an archive that had psychological evaluations, therapeutic reports, trips to sex therapy centers, and so forth, he is accumulating these different kinds of categories. I think the question is, are these categories necessary? I don't want to celebrate them. I think, scholars of both sexuality studies, but also science and technology studies would kind of look sideways at the last 100 years of trying to diagnose sexuality and create categories of sexuality and their historical contingency. or their observation that they're historically contingent or they just emerge for a moment, allows me to also point out that these very identities that these experts are building kind of brick by brick can be unbuilt brick by brick when a person like Roni is relocated in a place that doesn't have these categories. So I definitely don't want to celebrate the category of pedophilia and think it's necessary for justice. I do want to stress that in a small indigenous town, a North American or an American priest who has access to children, that there are really no way for example, this young woman, Justina, to speak up or any kind of authority to which she could turn to say, I've been in his house for 10 years.
Yeah, and if you haven't read the book, one of the most interesting things about, if it's okay to,
Please.
is about the historical contingency of abuse, is how Kevin uses Foucault. And so I highly recommend, right, if you're thinking about the history of sexuality and how these things are built brick by brick and how they can be undone, the ways in which he ties Foucault's, not necessarily theory, but Foucault's life into the story, I think is a really important and creative and devastating part of the text. I've got 3 questions left, and then we'll open it up. And I want to start to move us towards thinking about the next. Where are we going? But first, I want to ask about the writing process, Kevin. So kind of a 2-part question. You mentioned in the book that Justina helped you in writing the book, right? Helped you rethink about what to highlight, what to center in the conversation, in a conversation that is in many ways triggering for many. Can you share a little bit about how Justina shaped what's in the book and how you navigated what to include? And when I read that Justina was part of it, I kept coming back to that cloak, which is not a part of Justina's story, but that's kind of a crucial fact, right? So there's this detail about Roni's cape, and it's really illuminating to many of the arguments of the book, not so much as evidence of Roni's crimes, but as a symbol of the relationship between public exhibitionism and priestly protection, and why a kind of concealment was necessary in one place and unnecessary in another. But I imagine a detail of that kind of graphicness is also something that you wrestled with, whether or not to include it. So that's the first part. The second is that there are ways in which the archive is really central to this story, both its presence and absence in an official sense, but also what constitutes the archive, right? And I think you talk about sort of the trail running cold once Roni gets on that plane, and then when you get on that plane to Guatemala to follow that. But there are a lot of artifacts that you include in the book, right? Father Roni's photographs, the statue of Justina that he builds, right? And so in what ways, Kevin, does your book change the archive, what's included in the archive, and maybe even the definition of what constitutes an archive?
Yeah, that's great. Let me start with the archival question. I mean, what's exciting in Pack and Seymour also, because we're working together on this project at the University of New Mexico, but the Archdiocese of Santa Fe filed for bankruptcy and found settlement with survivors. And one of the non-monetary agreements that they came to, and this was unprecedented, was that the Archdiocese would release the quote-unquote abuse files to the University of New Mexico. So here is like, to render public, and now there's a lot to talk about that. Like, have they given all the files? No, not at all. Is there like a struggle over what counts as abuse file? Yeah, absolutely. But it's a very powerful first step as to having information increasingly public. And the Archdiocese of New Orleans has followed suit. There is like this domino effect, we hope, in terms of the release of files. Now, what's interesting about that archive is that it's an archive generated through bankruptcy. So it's a very specific archive. It's depositions, it's personnel files, the risk is, as we kind of turn towards this new wave of information, that the study of clerical sexual abuse is almost predetermined by bankruptcy proceedings, which conceptually is extremely interesting. It's a robust archive. You're finding things that are quite surprising. One that I just always am struck by is that Bishop Lucker mean, they have this kind of like archival imperative to save everything. And Lucker at one point in a meeting is doodling on a legal pad, and he writes, news of Roni raising this young girl in Guatemala concerns me. Why'd that guy write it down? Why'd he archive it? Crazy. But it does end up in the archive. So they're robust archives, but they are circumscribed by this very specific legal process in the United States. I do think as an anthropologist, I could not work with such an archive in Guatemala, and I'm very comfortable working with alternative sources. One of them, for example, as you mentioned, Roni was a prolific photographer. And what he did was effectively use these photographs in a community really starved of visual history, use these photographs as kind of gift exchange and put people under obligations such that, oh, here's a photograph of your family, or here's a photograph of your children, thank you so much, and would then kind of, this would give him access to children and homes. So one way that I was able to really clock his pattern of abuse in Guatemala was to kind of just to go door by door and see like, hey, do you have any photos from Roni? Some people would have one or two, others would have hundreds, and those were brutal moments. In terms of writing with Justina, we worked for years. And I think ultimately, and I could talk much more about that process, I am the author, I have authorial, I mean, like, I'm not gonna act like it was co-authored, I'm not, but her input was critical and crucial, and at the end, you know, had the full manuscript translated into Spanish, and her point was like, you know, the earlier draft had a lot more scenes of, the current book has no scenes of abuse. There's allusions to it. But the book that is out does not. And that was, you know, very wise counsel on her part. I will say you get extraordinary readings of the book, even reviewers who are like, yeah, but I don't see any, I mean, what happened, like what exactly happened? Are you sure maybe that was just a fate? Like even very accomplished colleagues really start to have this apologetic kind of positioning where, for me, you know, it's rare as an anthropologist to turn into a field of study and be like, there are some certain facts on the table. 1, he's a perpetrator. 2, he ends up in Guatemala. 3, he raises this young woman, this young girl, Justina, for a decade. That's like clear, but it's extraordinary the kinds of like, I don't know, like questionings, doubts. Anyway.
It's certainly an interesting way to parse the text. It would be interesting to think about why is the impetus there to parse it in that way? That seems problematic. Last 2 questions I'm going to ask to both of you. The first one, there are some words that just show up either repeatedly or in really deep moments of reflection. And so I'm going to provide a list of a few words, and I'd like each of you to pick 1 or 2 and expand on what it means to you or why you think it's so vital in this conversation. So 1 is the obvious one, unforgivable, global, uneven, business model, tree, or time.
It does have the feel of like a word game or something. Do you want to, wait, can you do it again? It's like a haiku, do it.
Unforgivable, global, uneven, business model, tree, time.
Yeah. Do you want me to start? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll set a tone. I'll go with business model. I mean, I think at the end of the day, and Pat can check me on this, he has decades in this world. The movement of perpetrators from North America to Latin America, and that's just one itinerary, isn't just diabolical or cruel or just incredibly flagrant when it comes to being human. It's a shrewd business decision. So if we just think about Roni and Justina, and the full kind of list of Roni's survivors, we will never know. But Justina in Guatemala, if the average, and you can check me on this, but if the average payout after the New Ulm settlement was in the ballpark of kind of over 300,000 before legal fees. And if Justina's case, which was extraordinary in terms of the facts of the case, if that had been brought, because there was only, we could get into this, bankruptcy, it's also a story about bankruptcy. There was just a 3-year window where people could bring their claims, their cases to the bankruptcy. And she missed that window for very strategic purposes. But her settlement could easily have been close to 7 figures. And she came away with just a few $1,000s. It's a shrewd business deal to isolate someone who is a threat, not only to like your credibility, but also to your bottom line, to move them to a place where they can't affect it. So like this is really like a business decision and part of a larger business model for me. So that's how I would interpret business model.
I'll take Unforgivable. One of the things this story does is it describes one of the most difficult things I think in the whole book does. It describes the indifference of the clergy in this. Just complete indifference. The average person who finds out that a child has been hurt is appalled. And the hair stands up on the back of their neck. They have their stomach gets all torn up. I mean, there is a physical response to all this. But I think what has happened, and as you see throughout the file, not just in the Roney file, but that bishops, this is just the price of being in this position. This is what you endure. And so it's like, it's another business thing that happens. And it's the indifference to suffering. And by not stopping Roney sooner, you automatically send these kids to a life of suffering. And that is the thing that's the most unforgivable in the whole process. That's one of the reasons I think it's important to read in pieces. I wouldn't sit down and do a power weekend on it. I would break it up over time. But the indifference to suffering still completely boggles my mind, and why there isn't any level of empathy in the response.
Now, the moving forward question, right? The bearing witness and beginning again. So the book, and I want to frame it with 2 pieces. The book includes a kind of rawness of your experience and your emotions and your struggles in the project, right? I mean, it's a very human book in many ways, and you are one of the humans in that story. And I was struck at the end of part 4, which ends with, quote, Justina agreed to participate and we worked together, but sometimes I wish she had said no, unquote. But then to move backwards to the preface, right? The preface ends with this ethical turning point where you describe the research as transformative, well unbearable, and promise that this book is, quote, just the beginning, unquote. So I'm interested in hearing from both of you about how you processed that unbearableness that you encountered, but like the book does, pushed beyond the unbearable, and what kind of forms of reckoning and repair do you imagine from here, whether that's through scholarship, advocacy, even in faith itself?
There are several things I've found very powerful and hopeful over the last few decades. In the bad old days, nobody believed you, even my own mother, that priests would sexually offend children. That was not a philosophical category that was allowable in their mindset. So that has been a powerful switch. I remember in some of my earliest declarations where, the defense lawyer would make an argument on behalf of their client saying the priest was not there. And I would make go to the copy machine. We We used to have those, and put the official Catholic directory down. He was there in 1989. He was the pastor, and submit it and say, Your Honor, either they lied to the IRS back then and made a mistake, or they're lying to you now. So you just have to ask them which bullet they want to bite. So there's a whole openness that has happened in the United States, in English common law countries. There's been a very slow process. One of the things that was powerful in interviewing some of these priests, especially if they had fled to foreign countries, in sitting down and talking with them, is they're straightforward. They will tell you exactly what happened, as long as they're not implicating a statute of limitations somewhere. So if you're in Ireland talking to a priest, they will tell you anything they did in the United States because they know the statute's gone and they can't go to jail for it. They won't talk to you about what happened in Ireland because they can go to jail right now because there is no statute of limitations for childhood sexual assault. So we still have this complete unevenness across the world that we really need to standardize. And maybe it's just Roman training, but it's to have a standard across the way to protect children would be fantastic. And then, the other thing is the documents are there. Unfortunately, a lot of documents have been destroyed. Dr. Fireman, who worked at the Servants of the Paraclete for several decades, they started destroying documents in 1999 on all of these files. The amount of intelligence in that could have been garnered from that to help, protect kids moving forward, unfortunately, is gone. But we do have way too many documents to handle, as we just from Santa Fe alone. So to be able to study that, I think, is going to be helpful. To keep changing minds, to keep changing, especially criminal statutes of limitations, and then to standardize it across the way, and then just so that I don't care what tradition you come from, so that every religious faith understands that if you because these are fixated sex offenders, these folks don't deviate. Once they lock on to this, it is part of their DNA. And so we need to get them away from their target population. However we do that, and so they need to act and not say, this is just a one-off thing. Because I've testified in Guam, I've testified in multiple different places. It's the same kind of activity, it's the same conduct. And if we continue to learn, maybe a whole bunch of kids won't end up like the poor girls in Guatemala.
No, that's really well put. Yeah, looking forward, just the beginning, absolutely. So Pat's mentioned the Servants of the Paraclete several times. That's where David Roney was sent to New Mexico. That's the current project right now, is this global history. It's this very strange religious order that started in 1947 for the explicit intent of ministering to kind of wayward priests, and they took on a great deal of the work they effectively became sex therapy centers just a few decades later, and populated around the world. Currently, they're headquartered in Missouri, but their active sites are in the Philippines, Ghana, and Vietnam, as well as a very, very small country known as San Marino. It's the fourth smallest country. It's landlocked to the north of Italy. It's historically a tax haven. And so continuing with that research, Pat and I have been out there. I've been out there several times. It's just active sites. And so for me, it's just the beginning intellectually and in terms of research, absolutely. In terms of the capacity for advocacy, I ultimately think that's the kind of work we're doing for building archives. When it comes to, as Pat is saying, creating more opportunities internationally for these conversations, I don't yet have a sense of what that would look like. Anthropologists are really good at kind of noticing that things are different in other parts of the world, and it has a really uneven history of trying to smooth some of that stuff out. So that is still an open question, but for some reason, the archive gives me hope these days.
A few quick words of thanks. First, obviously, thanks to Kevin and Pat for their time, their brilliance, their kindness. to share with us in this way. Big thanks to the director of the Religious Studies program for all that she does to keep the program running, and reminder, if you do see her out around the food, to congratulate her on the release of her book. And thanks to our co-sponsors, but mostly thanks to all of you for attending. We appreciate you coming out, and I hope we see you at many more events and functions in the near future. So thank you.